Alright guys, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good middle of the night. Probably a couple people watching at like 3 a.m. That's a go-to YouTube move. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah. It's one of those weird days in between Christmas and New Year's where you kind of forget what day it is. I think it's the 28th today. But anyway, that's completely irrelevant to what I wanted to talk about today. What I wanted to talk about today is just the overall topic of anxiety and how it manifests differently in different people, and really my own personal interaction throughout my life with anxiety and how it has affected me and how it has held me back in certain aspects of my life. But I also think it's helped me in other ways. And I also think anxiety can help a lot of other people in other ways, depending on how you look at it or if you find the silver lining. But I guess I'll start off by saying everybody has anxiety. Even if somebody says they don't have anxiety, they do have anxiety to a certain level. It's just a natural thing to have. That's not the same thing as having an anxiety disorder. That's obviously something completely different. That comes down to more neurological things in your brain that are actually going wrong, and you actually are feeling anxiety for things that are completely harmless. But that's something else. But at the same time, I don't think we should invalidate anybody's anxiety. Everybody's anxiety is real to them. So it's important to remember that everybody's struggling. And just because you may have more panic attacks than somebody, or may have gone to the ER more times than somebody, doesn't mean that their anxiety is any less important to them than your anxiety is to you. But starting off with my story and my anxiety, it was really bad as a child. That was probably when it was the worst, but we'll wrap around to that and tell the whole story. But when I was a kid, I remember, not at a very super young age, but probably around the age of 10 or 11, when you're starting to become aware and more conscious of, what kind of clothes you're wearing, and the girls at school, and the different cliques and groups at school. And that's when I really began to kick in with me about what did I look like, what did certain girls think about me? And obviously all of that's normal. Everybody goes through all that. That's just a normal 4th, 5th grader, experience that everybody goes through. Now, what started to change for me, I think, as I started to isolate myself a little bit more. I became really afraid to talk to people at school that I felt were above me or above my level. And that was pretty much everyone. So, and I was never bullied or picked on. I did have a lot of stuff going on at home, and I didn't have the greatest home life. So looking back, it probably had more to do with that. Because my school life was never bad. I never had bad teachers. I always had friends, not a ton of friends, but friends that always had my back. I was never really picked on that bad. But as soon as I hit that age, around middle school-ish, I just really withdrew, and I really just kind of saw all these different cliques and groups of people, and I just felt like I didn't belong. And like I said, I had a lot of stuff going on in my home life at this time, which probably contributed to a lot of the way I felt. I really just didn't feel worthy to be around these other people, and I was also kind of short for my age. Well, I was really short for my age and small, which kind of didn't help me either in the confidence department, especially with girls or anything else. But I remember at my worst in classes, I would literally sit in the middle of the class, do everything I could to avoid eye contact with the teacher, all the little tricks. Everybody says sit in the back of the classroom, but that's the worst place to sit because the teachers are going to pick on the back row the whole time. So I would try to just blend in with the crowd. And that was my worst nightmare, was ever getting picked on by the teacher. And I actually, I'm sure everybody has had the same experience in school, college, high school, elementary school. where you go around the classroom and the teacher picks people to read a certain section out of a book. At least that's how it was when I went to school. Now it's probably reading out of a tablet or whatever. But I was always so scared for when it would come around to my turn to like read. I would count out the sections ahead, like in the textbook, and I would find the paragraph that I had to read, and I would read it all beforehand to make sure that I wasn't going to stutter. And I've always been a really good reader too. That was the funny part, is I could always read and articulate things pretty quickly and pretty well because I enjoyed reading on my own time anyway. But I was just so anxious of even stuttering over a word or mispronouncing a word that I had to read the paragraph once or twice before I would even do it in front of the class, and then I was still completely terrified to do it. But another thing that was really bad when I was a kid is I couldn't order food at like a fast food restaurant, or say if we went to a movie theater, I couldn't go up and like order popcorn or a ticket. I had this huge phobia and anxiety of like talking to adults and going in situations like that and asking them. I felt like I was overstepping my boundaries, even though I knew they were doing their job. I felt like I was being an asshole asking them to like give me popcorn or whatever it was. I felt like I was overstepping my boundaries. So it literally got to the point where like my grandparents and my mom would have to make me go and like ask for a refill on my soda or whatever it was, just to get me to interact with a waitress or whoever it was working in retail that was helping us out, because I felt too ashamed to like ask for help and was just so isolated in my own bubble. This anxiety-ridden life that I had built around myself, that I just didn't want to talk to anyone. Now, going through high school, it did actually stay the same or probably got worse because I moved in high school. Now, for a while, it had gotten better. I was making friends. I was like a normal 13, 14-year-old. Obviously still had like the normal anxieties that any 13, 14-year-old would have. But I had more friends. I was kind of coming out of my box and my shell a little bit. But then reverting back to, like I said before, there was a lot of stuff going on in my home life. And I ended up having to switch high schools midway through high school. So the season or the summer between my sophomore and junior year, I ended up switching high schools. Not just switching high schools, but moving to a completely different area and switching high schools and moving in with my grandparents. So living with somebody completely different. And that totally just threw me back into an anxiety-ridden hole. It was super hard for me to meet friends in a new school, which I think it would be for anyone kind of transferring. But I think normal people would adapt even in 2 years, and you'd find friends, and I just couldn't put myself out there. And again, it wasn't like people would try to be friends with me and like talk to me, and it was almost like I was coming off as an asshole, but it was really just because I had this such intense anxiety that I couldn't keep a conversation with anybody longer than a couple minutes before I just had to run away because I was getting too anxious and I just couldn't handle it. But anyway, that was the story up through high school. Now, once I got into college and started working, this is when everything completely changed, and my thoughts about anxiety completely changed, and my worldview really completely changed. Is when I got thrown in to my first ever job. Now, basically, I had gotten away with my whole life up to that point, not really having to interact with people. At least not interact with people that are super stressed out. I always had ways, even in classrooms, of kind of putting myself in the background. In group projects, I always kind of found a way of slipping through the cracks, and again, always being in the background. When you're working in retail, there's no way that's gonna happen. You have to deal with people. That's just the nature of the job. And at first, I was really anxious about this. I was like, how am I gonna do this? I'm so deathly afraid to talk to people. And then I got thrown out there, and it was that fight or flight kind of thing, but it was the first time in my life I had no option. Like there was no flight, so I had to fight, essentially. So I did my job. I sat there talking to people, and before I knew it, about 6 months into my first job, which was working at a ski resort, so I was dealing with like a lot of people, renting out skis and boots, I was like, this really isn't that bad, and I'm actually really not that bad at it. Like, I'd gone around my whole life watching people and being so anxious, but I had watched, social cues, and I understood what made people uncomfortable. I understood what made people anxious, and I realized all of that, accumulating all of that information as a child actually helped me communicate better with people as an adult, because I was able to recognize like those little cues of when people were uncomfortable or that they needed help. And it actually helped me a lot in like retail settings, because I can notice like certain little cues like that. So that's why I think anxiety can actually help you in ways. Also, another way anxiety can help you, I think, is in interviews. Anxiety has helped me a lot of ways, I think, in getting jobs, because if you go into a job, now I'm not saying going into an interview completely anxious is a good thing. It's not. You should go into a job interview confident. That's definitely the way you should do it. But having anxiety before your job interview, I think, is good, because that'll push you into actually researching and actually focusing on what's coming up and preparing yourself. It's all about taking this anxious energy and trying to funnel it towards something productive. Now, I know sometimes it could get to the point where you're too anxious and you can't do anything except for think about how fast your heart is beating and, trying not to pass out, because I've also had experiences like that too. And we'll get into that and how I overcame that. But as far as these and my general senses of anxiety I've had through my life, that was just kind of how I dealt with it. As I got older into my 20s, it got better just because it had to get better. I was working, I was living life, but then I also realized, everybody puts up with anxiety. I lived my whole childhood thinking it was just kind of a me problem. When you start working and being around people, you realize everybody's anxious. Everybody has this predisposed to having these things that they're self-conscious about. And it's just, you have to go through life and realize that, and like, you're not the only one. And communication can actually pull you out of that social anxiety and the anxiety you feel. So it's actually doing the very thing that you want to do the least, which is going out and interacting with people, that I think helps pull you out of anxiety the most, instead of isolating yourself, which is what your brain is telling yourself to do, because you've basically taught your brain over time that dealing with people is bad and you want to avoid those situations at all costs, because those are negative, dangerous situations. And now you've trained your brain to believe that. The only way to get out of that is to push yourself into more and more social interactions and more social situations, until you can positively reinforce in your brain that these are good interactions and this is a good, safe place to be. Because anxiety and self-isolation is a real thing. And that's what I'll dive in to when I had really bad anxiety in my life. And it was induced by drug abuse and by mental illness. But there was a 2 or 3 year stretch in my life where I had